Hello everyone. Today we have for you a mini haul from another orchid show. This show was actually organized by another orchid society that we have here in Portugal, other than the one that's been organizing the last few shows we went to. But this one hadn't made any events since the pandemic started. So this was quite a small show, but with a really good variety of sellers. Most of them were here from Portugal, except from a seller from Ecuador. And we actually posted a video about that show, so if you want to check out the orchids, you can go see the video we posted about 2 weeks ago. We weren't really planning on buying any particular orchids, but while we were picking up some fertilizer from this national seller, we noticed a few of their mounted miniatures that we couldn't pass on. The first thing that caught my eye was this one, and I'm gonna put the name on the screen because with all of these I will butcher their names, so you might as well read them. The first one I noticed was this, which is an orchid I've actually been after for quite a while. It's from the Uncatum family, and as you can see, it looks like a tiny little tolumnia, and I find it adorable. I think it was at some point called a tolumnia, but it has gone through a few name changes since then. In the orchid show, there actually was one of these in flower from one of the club members, but I already knew what it looked like since it was a plant I've been wanting for a while. I've been accumulating quite a few Oncidium miniatures, and they have really big flowers for how small the plants are. They usually have really interesting foliage. Mine seem to be doing well. We just flowered our first tolumnia, and they're just so adorable. Okay, so as you can see, for this one, because everyone says it has to be very, very draining, I use a mix of small bark and this really fine bark that I don't remember exactly for what orchid I bought it, but it was something very specific that needed something like that. And since I've been kind of replacing perlite for some repots with this very small sized bark, because it still doesn't maintain a lot of moisture, but it does fill some of the air pockets, so it might be able to give me a day or two more in between waterings. And with my tolumnias, I cannot resist the temptation of putting a little bit of sphagnum in the mix, but with this one being a completely different species and the first time I'm growing it, and adding to the fact that we're going into winter, I didn't want to risk it. So for now I'm going to keep it like this, and when the summer comes, if she's still here, and it's being very hard to keep it hydrated, I can put a little top layer of sphagnum, or maybe put a few pieces of sphagnum through the holes, and that should about do it. I know on camera it looks like she's too buried in the bark, but I can assure you she isn't. Wouldn't it be great if those flower spikes she came with actually rewarded us with some flowers still this year? We'll see. This next one, actually Jay found it in the middle of all the mounts, and we found that the plant has such a unique shape with the canes that we were immediately intrigued. I did a quick Google search while we were there and I couldn't find anything about it, just very few articles, nothing talking about care. And I asked the seller from that store, which usually knows the stuff about orchids, and his reaction was pretty much the same. It's the first time they're carrying it, they don't know much about it, so he couldn't really tell me much about how to keep this plant. But we were so intrigued about the way it looks that we just decided to bring it. I have looked online and it becomes a bit complicated because websites can't even decide what section of Dendrobium this is supposed to be a part of. I found one reference that says that it's supposed to have a winter rest, and a bunch of them that says to water it equally throughout the year. So this one is going to be a bit of a mystery on how to take care of it. We considered using one of our oldest types of mounts that we did with some plastic netting and some hot glue. But honestly, I find using these pieces of the see-through net pots that we got from Rolke, I find it much easier. You can just put the substrate in, put as much bark and sphagnum as you want, and then tightening up these two pieces with some zip ties. And I think it looks much nicer. I was able to get a much smaller mount for this. So I think it ends up being much more attractive. And here's the Dendrobium all mounted. Another thing we've been doing the past few years with mounts is instead of fixing the plant with fishing line, which is usually a nightmare. You need like 10 sets of hands to do it. What I've been doing is, well, with plants that have a good enough root system, is putting the roots inside the mount and then just running a few strands of sphagnum like this to kind of secure it on top. And as long as the sphagnum isn't touching any of the pseudobulbs, it's just touching the root system, it usually is enough to hold the plant until it can make its own root system. As you can see, it's pretty okay in there. And again, since I had very little information about how to water this plant, what I did was put quite a bit of sphagnum near the roots in case it needs moisture, but I didn't want to make it too thick a layer, so the back of it is just bark. And since it's a pretty open mount, we can always adjust as the plant goes along. The fact that it's a pretty succulent plant is probably going to actually help us figure out what it likes in terms of moisture. I know some people were asking how we make our mounts, and I wanted to show you like the more fancy ones. Not that they look very fancy, but the more elaborate ones with a net and the hot glue. But honestly, I'm pretty sure I'm going to keep using these because I have plenty of those net pots, and this to me actually looks better. This one, I saw the picture of the flower there and it really intrigued me because it's a really beautiful flower for such a tiny little plant, as you can see against my hand. And I had no idea what this orchid was. I couldn't tell by the name. I needed to do some research before I knew it was a Dendrobium type of orchid. And this is another one that internet research really isn't helpful. I asked the seller if this would be like something that could take heat in the summer because of us, and he pretty much said that his greenhouse sometimes reaches 40 degrees Celsius, so this plant should do fine. And I pretty much trusted that because he has more experience with it than I do, certainly. But as soon as we got home and I started doing some more detailed research, the first thing I hit is a website that says that this is a cool grower. And then another website that said intermediate to cold. Then another website that says intermediate, all with very different temperatures. So I started freaking out a little bit. Fortunately, I found two websites that I usually trust for this type of thing, saying that it is intermediate, pretty much up to like 26 degrees Celsius. So I think other than a few days, maybe in August, I'm pretty sure this thing is going to do well here. It does seem to have a bit of a rambly growth pattern. So I'm pretty sure it would prefer to be mounted, but we're gonna try the pot first because I cannot deal with mounts. I have a few and I want to keep them to a minimum. This thing that it came in, it's clearly a homemade mount that the seller does, but I'm not gonna keep it here any longer because it's not the handiest thing for watering. According to my research, this plant should be kept just pretty much moist. It shouldn't really dry out. One of the sources mentioning reducing the water in winter, but you know, reducing from constantly moist, not like giving it a proper winter rest. With this one, we kind of had a bit of a conundrum that we have many times because the root system is not very deep, the roots aren't very long, but because the plant seems to kind of wander and climb and stretch itself in a way that, let's face it, it's much more appropriate to keep in a mount. We would need something shallow but wide. And one thing I'm going to try and use is these things, which I think were yogurt cups that my mom had. And we made some holes with a soldering iron, like we do for all of our pots actually. And we're going to try and grow this little orchid here. I actually think it looks really cute. She was surprisingly easy to repot because even though it has this climbing nature that we usually hate in repots, maybe because it was mounted before, all the pseudobulbs seemed to be leaning and making roots in the same direction, which means I just had to lay it in there and put fluffy sphagnum moss in there for when the bulbs make new roots. I wanted to add a little bit of bark just because, you know, I didn't want it to get too stale in the middle. And I think I ended up putting a bit too much bark in there. So at some point I might have to redo this. But for now I'm just going to try and keep it very moist, like most of the culture guides I read say you should keep it. Maybe placing this inside another cup to maintain moisture. We'll see in the next few weeks. So that was our little our mini haul from the most recent orchid show. I hope you enjoyed this video and that you check out the video from 2 weeks ago from the show because it truly was a lovely show. The plants being exhibited were beautiful. And we had a great time, actually. We enjoyed just watching what all the vendors had to offer. You had a specialist in terrariums, you had a specialist in succulents. We bought some tea from an artisanal type of tea shop that was there. We bought some handmade stamps, some orchid-shaped handmade stamps that some lady had there that are also lovely. So it ended up being a very good time at a time that we actually really needed it. So between that and how wonderful these plants look, we couldn't be happier. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and please consider subscribing to our channel. We'll see you next week. Goodbye.